Of all the different forces we're going to talk about, friction in terms of our overall lives is a really important one. And so, friction is a force, and that's what we're talking about here. And it's a force that opposes the motion of two objects past each other. So, think of like a box sitting on the floor. There's friction between the box and the floor, and that friction prevents that box from moving. That's why the box doesn't just start sliding when like an air current pushes it or something like that. And actually, if there was no friction, even small little air currents or barely pushing this box would start to accelerate. It would move it around the floor. But luckily, we have friction, and so what friction does is it provides a force that prevents that box from moving. So friction can sometimes be a good thing. Friction, for example, allows us to stand up. It allows us to walk around. And if you've ever walked on ice, for example, you've noticed that there's not much friction there. And so it's a lot harder to stand upright and certainly to walk around. And then it'd be especially more difficult to run on something with not very much friction. And so friction can be a really good thing, but friction can also be a bad thing. Friction is bad, like in an engine in a car, for example. And so inside your engine in your car, you have pieces of metal that are basically sliding past each other. And so that builds up a lot of heat. It's one of the reasons why your engine gets hot, is due to the friction, plus, of course, the gasoline that's burning. But friction is bad in an engine. And so we do things like add oil to it, to the engine in order to prevent that metal from getting too hot. If you run an engine without oil for more than maybe a minute or two, that engine is going to overheat, and it could actually crack the engine block and basically totally destroy your engine. So there's a lot of good uses or facts or things about friction in our everyday life, but there's also a lot of bad things about it as well. Now, we won't get into the equation for friction in terms of how you calculate it. It's a pretty simple equation. But that equation gives us two things that determine the amount of friction. Okay, so the first one is the type of surface or surfaces that are in contact with each other. So, as you probably know, different surfaces have different amounts of friction. For example, it's a lot easier to walk on a piece of concrete, like a sidewalk or something, than it is to walk on ice, right? And the difference there is not your shoe. Your shoe could be the same between those two surfaces, but it's the type of surface that you're walking on, ice versus concrete. And so that gives us something we call the coefficient of friction. And you don't really need to worry about that terminology, but that coefficient of friction, which is part of this equation that I just mentioned, is what helps determine the amount of friction that is available between the two surfaces. The other one is the amount of force that is pushing the surfaces together. So this kind of makes sense too. If you think about like a box, if you were to try to push an empty box across the floor, you might notice it's pretty easy to push an empty box across the floor. If, however, that box has maybe a big refrigerator in it or bricks or something like that, you'll notice that it's much more difficult to push that box across the floor. And so the surfaces haven't changed, right? You still have the box and you still have whatever the floor you're pushing it on. But the amount of weight, in other words, the force that is pushing the box and the floor together, is different in that case. Now there are some other things going on there with inertia and such, but gives you kind of a pretty good idea. We'll do another example in class where you're using your hands to kind of demonstrate this effect as well. So this is the extra part of the video just to make sure it doesn't cut off my voice. So hopefully you're not hearing this. If you are, that's not good. That's not good at all. Do 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 do.